AMD's Ryzen 7 2700 launch was really interesting because it was right in between when Intel was starting to lose its grasp a little bit with the 7700K and when Intel really came back strong against the first launch of Ryzen and then the subsequent Zen Plus launch. So the 2700 came out in a way that looked really impressive. It was starting to turn the tide in a significant way against Intel, where Zen 1 looked reasonable in a lot of workloads like production. It was, hey, this is a real architecture. AMD can actually do this. Zen Plus became a, hey, AMD might actually be starting to gain some ground where Intel was untouchable. So it was a big deal. But the 8700K came out and really changed things in a way that made the market exciting for a while. So today, we're revisiting the AMD Ryzen 7 2700 CPU and basically 2700X by matter of overclocking to see how it does in 2020, which isn't that long after launch, but there's more stuff coming soon. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our brand new Gamers Nexus wireframe mouse mat. Aside from being the best way to directly support our long-form investigative reporting, you can also get a custom-made, high-quality mouse mat made with a high-detail 3D design that we created to show off heatsinks, coolers, video cards, and more. The mouse mat uses a stitched blue border for added longevity, a blue rubber underside for unique flare, and a microfiber cloth for smooth tracking. The mat is 36 inches by 12 inches and fits a keyboard and mouse easily. We sold out of the first run in 48 hours, but have more getting made right now. To backorder your mouse mat and ensure you get one in the next run, go to store.gamersnexus.net and backorder yours while reducing our reliance on advertisers, or click the link in the description below. So again, the thing that really made the 2700 and 8700K era exciting as reviewers was specifically that it wasn't really one-sided anymore. It was clearly the 2700 came out and established a firm foothold. The 8700K came out and really socked AMD pretty hard. It was a lot more level than it used to be, but it went from the 2700 starting to really gain ground in gaming, objectively leading in production workloads, especially dollar for dollar and even at a price class up versus Intel, to suddenly with the 8700K, Intel's in the lead for gaming. Intel's basically tied in a lot of production applications. It's ahead in some of them. And that's where it was interesting for us, because now you've got a really direct head-to-head fight between two good processors, and it was actually a company responding to another company's gauntlet throw, and so that's what we liked. Today we're looking again at the 2700. For a while it was priced at about $200. So towards the end of its life and right around the 3000 launch, the 2700 came down significantly in price. There were times we saw it on retailers brand new for $180, and that's part of what made it a really widespread choice, because even though its value was decent after Intel launched its response and good when it first launched, it became extremely good when it was in the $200 price class. It was just untouchable in that pricing. So really widespread processor. Now, a couple of notes here. The 3000 series, we already looked at how that does versus the 2000 series back when everything launched. This is with all new updated methodology for us. It's with updated versions of Windows, of drivers, all that stuff. So all the data is new. And then the other point is that obviously publicly now, the XT series is coming up, and that's going to be a higher clock update to the 3000 series CPUs. So if you're watching this, wondering if you should upgrade your 2700, this will help you start to get the bearings on where it falls today, or if you want to buy a used one maybe. And then and those should, by the way, become pretty prevalent. And then the piece to check back on obviously would be our XT reviews, where you'll be able to see what does that pathway look like. Our key focuses will be the 3900X, because since it's only one generation of a jaunt, that's going to be the best way to really extract any value out of it. We have 3700X numbers. We've got all the other numbers that are relevant in here. And then the 10600K would be your one to look at if you're interested in swinging away from AMD and going back towards Intel, or towards Intel for the first time for a gaming build. So let's get started with the numbers. Shadow of the Tomb Raider will start us off. In this one, the AMD R7 2700 fully stock plotted at 123 FPS average, ranking it alongside the R7 1700 at 3.9 GHz all-core. The differences between these two results are functionally non-existent. More impressively, however, the 1600 AF leads the 2700 at 4.2 GHz, but this shouldn't be surprising to anyone who's followed our 1600 AF coverage. It's just an R5 2600, so it's the same architecture, and at this point we're looking at a frequency advantage. Versus modern parts, the R7 2700 stock CPU allows the AMD 3300X a lead of 10%. The 3600 stock has a lead of 14%, and the 3700X has a lead of 21%. The Intel i5 10600K, for gaming reference, drops 2 cores, but bumps the clocks and also moves to Intel, landing at 163 FPS average and leading the R7 2700 stock CPU by 32%. Overclocking the 2700, which is comparable in some ways to a 2700X if you have one of those, you should look at these numbers, lands it at the level of an i5 10400 with 2666 memory and just behind the 3300X and 7700K stock CPUs. Although the 3300X ranks higher from its single CCX configuration and its architectural improvements, we wouldn't consider it an upgrade for many other reasons. If you bought an R7 2700, you probably bought it to use it at least sometimes in non-gaming workloads. Even if that's not the case, dropping threads feels bad, and the performance uplift is without many merits once the 2700 is overclocked anyway. The 3900X feels like a more appropriate or meaningful upgrade pathway all around, given that it's only been one generation, but this would still be a jump to an R9 CPU instead. It might be best to wait a little longer, though, before buying a replacement at all. Total War's campaign benchmark is up next. For this one, the AMD R7 2700 stock CPU ran at 100 FPS average, ranking it again functionally equivalent to the R7 1700 all-core OC of 3.9 GHz and just below the 1600 AF. But that's error and variance at this point. The 3700X ran at 125 FPS average, leading the 2700 stock CPU by 25% in average FPS. As for lows, the 3700X improves those measurably as well, jumping to 87 and 78 FPS, 1% and 0.1%, up from 70 and 63 previously. That said, the 2700 overclock shrinks the gap to 15% in averages. And overall, as we said in our original Ryzen 3000 series reviews, these are not CPUs that generally should be upgraded to from just one generation back, at least not without a jump in rank as well. Again, going to a 3900X would make more sense, but not because of gaming. That'd be for production workloads. The XT series might be the one that deserves more observation of its performance for gaming, but we need to wait for that one to come out. But from what we know so far, officially from AMD, it should increase performance specifically in these types of workloads. Hitman 2 is up now. The stock R7 2700 falls fairly low on the Hitman 2 charts. It beats the 1600 AF at 96 FPS average versus 94, but by a narrow enough margin to imply that the extra threads don't really make or break the performance. The 4-core 8-thread 3300X confirms this with its own average of 114 FPS. Generational improvements are clear. The original 1700 averages only 87 FPS stock, and the 3700X averages 118 FPS. Pushing the 2700 to 4.1 GHz gives it a 10% uplift over the stock results to 106 FPS average, but still behind the 3300X's results. The 3900X and 10600K are in another class entirely, for both of them, plotting well beyond the range where the 2700 is located. The 3900X averages 124 FPS, whether overclocked or not, putting it 29% beyond the stock 2700, and the stock 10600K does better still at 128 FPS average. F1 2019 is next, starting at 1080p and moving to 1440p in the next chart. This game typically shows a wide range of performance from its heavy dependence on frequency and limited thread performance. In this scenario, the R7 2700 stock CPU ends up just ahead of the 1600 AF, outside of error this time, and just below the 1700 at 3.9 GHz all-core. The 4.1 GHz all-core 2700 OC lands it close to the Intel i5 10400 with 2666 RAM, which is what you'd use on a B460 or H470 platform. As for meaningful or reasonable upgrade pathways, barring the suggestion to wait for the XT line, it looks like this. People who want to transition to a more gaming-focused build would benefit from the 10600K's stock performance of 260 FPS average here, a leap of 35% stock to stock, or more with an overclock, and even more still with a cache and a memory tune, not plotted here, but shown in different content. People more focused on improving workstation performance would only really see worthwhile value, again, in a jaunt to something like the 3900X, which has limited benefit in gaming. We see its baseline performance still improves by 24% stock to stock, though, which is a lot for a single generation. It's just that in the other games, we don't see this level of scaling, especially when you consider something like a 3700X or a 3600 instead, which still benefit from the architectural changes. 1440p creates more of a GPU constraint, so we start to see the performance clamping down towards the same values. They're all closer together now, with the 2700 OC functionally equating the 3900X stock CPU and 3600 stock CPU, albeit with measurably but not appreciably lower 1% low results. The upgrade options matter less, as always, if your gaming workloads are GPU bound. Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1080p high is next. We've been testing medium lately to reduce the GPU bottleneck, but the 2700 is still under a clear CPU constraint, even with high settings. That said, that does mean that the CPUs at the top of this chart have more scaling headroom if graphics settings were reduced, so the Intel i5 and i9 parts would be further ahead than they are here. Ultimately, though, it is important to keep realism in mind, even with targeted component benchmarking, and most people will realistically be playing this game with a GPU constraint, because it's very hard for GPUs to run. Under these more realistic use conditions, the R7 2700 stock CPU ends up just ahead of the 1600AF and just below the 1700 3.9 GHz all-core result. Overclocking the 2700 to 4.1 GHz all-core has it nearing the 7700K stock, which isn't meaningfully GPU bound here, so they're about the same. The 8700K is the one that gave AMD trouble when it launched, and it still maintains a lead and is against a GPU limit, right alongside the newer 10 series and the 9900K. These top parts are all within error of each other. From an upgrade standpoint then, in gaming, you're not gaining much with the pre-XT parts, so we'll have to check back to see if it's worth the jump, or if you should wait it out for Ryzen 4000. Or if you're just unhappy with your gaming frame rates you're getting now, the 10600K is still what we think as the best gaming CPU right now, especially for its level of tuning that's available to it. Our next game is Assassin's Creed, tested at 1080p. This game is interesting for its mix of high-frequency reliance and high-thread reliance combined. The R7 2700 stock CPU holds about 93 FPS average, with lows proportionally behind. The 1600AF stock and 1700 OC CPUs flank the 2700 stock result, with the 2700 OC at about the level of an i7 7700K CPU in stock. The 3600 and 3300X were both improvements, but obviously it's not worth paying a few $100s for a couple of FPS, at least not unless you're the type to buy Titans for gaming. The 8700K still gives the 2700 trouble, as it did at launch, and the 3700X gets into territory where it's a real improvement. We need to see impact from the XT series to know more, but if you feel like your 2700 isn't giving you enough frame rate, the obvious path is the 10 series CPUs. We'll see if the XT launch can give these enough competition in gaming while keeping people on the same platform, and then at that point it's just a war between whose part is in stock. People like to complain about GTA 5 being old, but the point of testing it is pretty simple. We have new games in our charts this year, like The Division 2 and a lot of our benchmarks, Red Dead 2, Three Kingdoms, and others, but we also need some more anchors from older times. GTA 5 remains one of the most popular games in the world, and gives us a unique look at a different way of programming a game. Grand Theft Auto 5 is reminiscent of our recent experience with Crysis in that it responds much more to increases in frequency than core count, at least past the point of the quad-core CPUs that ruled the market when the game launched. The 8-core 16-thread 2700 operates at 85 FPS average here, while the R3 1200AF 4-core 4-thread runs at 87 FPS average, with a 4.2 GHz overclock applied. AMD's X-SKU chips have also retained a speed advantage here, with the stock 3700X averaging 109 FPS and the stock 3900X averaging 112 FPS, a 32% lead over the 2700 stock. The 3900X's high limited core boost clocks means it gains almost nothing from an overclock, at least without doing memory tuning and things like that, while the 2700 improves by 12% up to an average of 95 FPS with a 4.1 GHz OC. Intel's 10600K leads all the AMD results with a stock average of 114 and an overclocked average of 122 without a cache tune. AMD has narrowed the gap significantly, but Intel CPUs generally have an advantage in gaming, but especially in GTA, due to their high limited core boost speeds. Production testing is where the Zen and Zen Plus desktop CPUs really shone in comparison to their Intel competition, mostly the 7700K of the era. The later 8700K did challenge AMD's Zen Plus launch, but it was a close fight. The 2700 is still a strong performer in Blender, even with a modern perspective applied. Its time to render our monkey head scene was 19.4 minutes stock, putting it amongst the results for the faster 6-core 12-thread Intel parts like the 8700K and the 10600K. This is why the 8700K was such fierce competition for the 2700. It was winning in gaming, and it was pretty close, if not about equal, in most of the production tests. The fact that the stock R5 3600 outperforms the 2700 here, with a render time of 18.3 minutes, is a credit to Zen 2's improvements, since the 2700's greater core count is a direct advantage in tile-based rendering as done with the Blender Cycles renderer. Each thread spawns one tile, and even that direct advantage couldn't outrun the 3600's gains. Overclocking the 2700 reduced render time by 13.4% down to 16.8 minutes, making it faster than the 3600's OC render time of 17.5 minutes. With all cores pushed to their maximum speed, the 2700 takes its rightful place on the chart, above the CPUs with fewer threads and below the ones with more, although within that category, it's still well below AMD's own 3700X. The render time is 13.9 minutes stock for that one, 17% time reduced from the 2700's all-core OC result. As for the 3900X, that jump would put you at about 9.6 minutes for this particular render, or a reduction of 51% stock to stock against the 2700. Our GN logo is seen as a heavier workload and takes longer to render than the monkey heads, so it leaves the CPU stack mostly the same. One change is that the 2700's 23.5 minute render time was half a minute faster than the 10600K's here, whereas the 10600K led by about the same amount in the monkey head test. It's close, but more cores is an explicit benefit in this test, so the 2700 has an advantage. With the 2700 at 4.1 GHz and the 10600K at 5 GHz, the 2700 wins out by 8% reduced time. Comparisons to AMD's current gen products are less favorable for the older CPU, with the 3700X completing the render 14% faster than the overclocked 2700. The 3900X, meanwhile, is now again at about $400, and it completes in 51.5% less time. Adobe Premiere is what we use in-house for video editing and rendering, and the test files we use with Adobe Premiere are real GN videos. The 1080p projects completed in 5.1 minutes on the stock 2700, and like the Blender benchmarks, the stack here correlates almost directly with the number of cores each CPU has. The 2700's relatively low stock clocks puts it closer to the performance of 6-core 12-thread CPUs like the stock 10600K, which landed at 5 minutes to render. Overclocking the 2700 cut render time down by 12% to 4.5 minutes, but the stock 3700X is still a tier beyond in performance at 3.8 minutes to render. The 3900X offers an additional cut, totaling 33% stock to stock versus the 2700. Our 4K Premiere project operates in much the same way as the 1080p one, but the longer render times can better reveal scaling between CPUs, as well as reducing the impact of limited duration turbo boosts and tau. The stock 2700 has a 4% advantage over the stock 10600K in this test, whereas in the 1080p test, they seem nearly tied. Overclocking the 2700 causes the same 12% reduction in render time that it did in the 1080p test, and this result is still behind the stock 3700X at 12.7 minutes versus 11.1 minutes. As for the 3900X stock CPU, now priced not distant from the original 2700X buying price, that one jumps to 8.9 minutes stock. The 3900X reduces render time by 39% when compared to the unmodified or stock 2700. 7-zip compression and decompression testing is what we're plotting next. The compression results are closer together than decompression, so we'll start there. The 7-zip ranks are in MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, with the 2700 stock CPU running at 55,000 MIPS and directly comparing to the 3600 and 10600K. This changes in the next chart, where the 2700 will establish a wider lead over the 10600K. For now, though, in the compression chart, the 10600K offers an appreciable gaming performance uplift, in CPU-bound scenarios at least, but its production performance is often more of a side grade at best, or a downgrade, depending on which application we're running. The 3900X would be the best upgrade path, ignoring the upcoming XT launch, at 84% improved, as opposed to the 2700 stock CPU's result. That's the biggest jump that we've seen so far, and it represents a clear architectural and core advantage. A 2700 OC gets it between the 1700 OC and 3700X, or 9900K stock CPUs for further reference, but not anywhere close to the 3900X. Decompression has the 2700 at 75,000 MIPS stock, or 87,000 overclocked. That has its stock result below the 3.9 GHz all-core 1700 result, showing benefit to the fixed all-core frequency, and also has it one step above the 3600. The 10600K, even at 5 GHz, gets left behind in this benchmark. Both threads and frequency have a fairly direct and scalable impact here, but not enough for the 10600K with just that frequency change. The 3900X puts this to the test further with a 66% gain over the overclocked 2700 result, or a 93% gain over the stock result. Building Chromium is a task that benefits directly from higher core counts and greater parallelism, but also faster CPUs to make up some of the difference. The stock 2700 finished the build process in 133 minutes, very slightly behind the stock 10600K at 132 minutes, and further behind the overclocked R7 1700 at 126 minutes. The 2700 reduced completion time by 13%, down to 116 minutes with an all-core 4.1 gigahertz overclock, but unlike the render benchmarks, this isn't enough to push it beyond all of the 6-core 12-thread parts on the chart. The 5 gigahertz 10600K couldn't keep up with the completion time of 122 minutes, but the overclocked 4.3 gigahertz 3600 did, and it did so exceptionally well by completing the build in 115 minutes. The 3700X and 3900X have advantages in speed and core count over the original 2700 here, but they also benefit over the Intel line in things like cache, which can matter in this test especially. The 3700X stock completed in 91 minutes, 21% faster than even the overclocked 2700. In stock versus stock, the 3900X took less than half the time to finish than the 2700 did. Power testing is last. This one is pretty interesting. In Blender, tested after tau expiry for Intel, the 2700 required about 76 watts to run an hour platform and configuration when measured at the EPS 12-volt cables. The R7 2700 overclock blew that out of proportion, but only because we blast the voltage to complete overclock numbers for reviews. Note that this could be tuned down in voltage with the newer bins primarily than ours was, which was a review sample. The 3900X required about 150 watts, so although we're seeing 50%, 80%, or similar uplifts in some applications, it's also increased in power consumption. The 3700X, meanwhile, measured 10 watts higher than stock, while offering universally disproportionate performance, leaning high, obviously, against the 2700. So there's an overall efficiency increase in the 3700X versus the 2700. The 10600K, for reference, ran at about 104 watts stock. In Cinebench R20, where we take Intel's numbers during boosting, so it's more relevant for high-end parts like the 10900K, AMD's positioning doesn't really change that much. It's still about 77 watts for the stock result, with the 3700X still at about 84 to 85 watts. So that's it for the 2700. Again, quick note, if you have a 2700X, you're wondering where that falls, just remember that the first gen of Ryzen, the second gen of Ryzen, so Zen and Zen Plus, the X and the non-X versions of the 700 series, 1727, they were basically just pre-overclocked versions of the non-X versions. And there's maybe an argument to the bin quality, but overall, if you're looking at a 2700X numbers, basically just look at our 2700 overclock, and you're gonna fall pretty close to that. So depending on the OC, you'll be between the base number and the OC number, or right around the OC number. It's close enough, doesn't matter. You're talking plus or minus a couple percent at that point. So that's where you would fall with the 2700X. Same thing, same idea. And overall, the CPU is obviously still plenty fine. It's only one generation old, but we wanted to specifically look back at it because of its popularity, because of the pivotal moment in CPU history recently where Intel and AMD were both really embattled and truly responding to each other in a direct, almost month-to-month fashion. The upgrade pathways, basically you're looking at, do you really want to go heavy with gaming? Maybe you bought the 2700 and your habits have changed, or you didn't quite use it the way you thought you would, and you want to push more towards the gaming build. Well, 10600K is incredible value for what it can do. We would really encourage you to try your hand at overclocking it, especially cache ratio tuning. It's not that difficult. And if you feel adventurous, try memory tuning. We have a whole separate piece on that. But really tunable CPU, good for gaming. It's basically best in class, especially at the price right now. 10900K is technically above it, but unless you're absolute FPS snob, the difference is negligible for most people. For non-gaming, the 3700X clearly is not really worth a dollar for dollar upgrade. Maybe you could justify it if you can get good resale value out of your 2700 depending on your region, and then you only spend maybe a delta of $100 to go to a 3700. That's probably worth it. But otherwise, well, first of all, wait for the XT series. Let's see how that does. Secondly, you're either waiting for Ryzen 4000 or you're basically upgrading within the 3000 category to the next SKU up. So that would be like a 3900X. And at $400, $420-ish these days, the 3900X is actually fairly compelling. Now, again, the XT series might impact that pricing, so maybe give it a little bit. That series at this point should have a known release date. It's soon. Can't recall right now if we are able to say it. It should be out there. Go Google it. But either way, that's what you're looking at. So there's the 2700 retested and updated for this new set of results coming out for the XT series soon. Thank you for watching. As always, you can support us directly at patreon.com/gamersnexus or store.gamersnexus.net. If you want to pick up something functional like a mod mat, a mouse mat, or one of our AMD X570 chipset posters where it's laid out like a Metro map. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.